So I think I'll switch to English. I will cut the introduction short because we have the 1 p.m. Meeting. So Vera is a senior research fellow at the Center of Social Sciences at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and she will present on a project concerned with media representations. But Vera is also very active in the survey field. She's the lead investigator of the European Social Survey in Hungary. And she is heading the Department for Methodology and History of Research, is it? Of the Academy of Sciences. I think I'll just give you the floor. You have like 30 minutes, I think, and then we will have a discussion. And we will finish in time for the faculty meeting.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting. It's a real honor to be here, and I wish that we can have a discussion. So I was asked to speak about a project that we conducted approximately 2 years ago about the media representation of the so-called refugee crisis, and its comparative analysis comparing the Austrian media's presentation of the crisis and the Hungarian media's presentation of the crisis. We did this research with my colleague Gábor Bernát, with whom we have done a lot of research on media representation of the Roma minority. In fact, this all came a bit later. So I would suggest that please feel free to ask if anything is not clear, and then I will try to keep what I'm saying short in order to be able to discuss as much as possible. So the main claims just to discuss or to be discussed by this presentation are the follows. So we found that the Hungarian government started to construct a moral panic around migration before the actual start of the crisis, as early as January 2015. It used heavily a securitization frame, dehumanizing migrants and presenting them as a threat to the country, and it has been like that ever since. I will show you that the comparison of the coverage of the refugee crisis by the Austrian and the Hungarian media at its peak in end of August and early September 2015 shows how pro-government media in Hungary presented events in a dehumanizing, securitizing frame, in contrast to the Austrian media's presentation. And the Austrian media at that point of time applied more a humanitarian approach to discussing the given events. I will speak about the independent media. Independent at those times was or acted differently than the governmental media. I will also show that the securitization frame was enforced not only in the discourse but in non-discursive acts of the Hungarian government. If I have time for that, I'm not sure whether I have time for that. So let me give you just a short context in Hungary, political context, and also social context. So up until 2015, migration and refugees were of absolutely minor interest to Hungary, to the Hungarian public, as well as media, as well as political discourse. Research on the media representation of migrants in 2014 showed that basically migrants were non-existent in the Hungarian media and also in the public discourse. And also migration is minor, so Hungary is a non-migrant country. The share of migrants is less than 2%, and the majority of migrants in Hungary are of ethnic origin coming from the surrounding countries to Hungary. So the point of departure to anti-migrant discourse that became so forceful was the 11th of January 2015, after the terrorist attack against the Charlie Hebdo editorial, when the Hungarian Prime Minister took on an explicitly negative discourse on migrants. He said in this speech that economic migration is a bad thing, in Europe. It causes only trouble and threat to Europeans. It has to be stopped, and this is Hungary's position. So this was the first time when he spoke about migration openly. And in the coming weeks, we experienced, so it was fairly early in 2015, there were no refugees, no migrants in Hungary at that time, but in the coming weeks, the government and governmental politicians spoke more and more about migration and identified migration and migrants as a threat in various ways. They identified it as a criminal threat, as a terrorist threat, as a threat to our welfare system, cultural threats, so all those kind of threats that social psychology describes very well in details. And then later on, in spring 2015, still no refugees, no migrants present at the borders. The Hungarian government launched the so-called National Consultation on Immigration and Terrorism. This is, I would like to raise your attention to that. This is a so-called survey, so a survey which is distributed to all households. It costs hell of an amount of money, and it's a fake survey because the questions themselves are completely biased. You can answer them only in one way, and also it's completely non-transparent. So the elaboration of the survey, the results, is completely non-transparent. So the results, what we get, we don't know what it refers to, what is the basic sample that they use. Anyways, and ever since then, this so-called national consultation is a very important means of the government's political tools set. So this consultation included biased questions linked refugees with terrorism, introduced terms like welfare migrants, economic migrants, illegal immigrants, and completely mixed by purpose the terms and concepts of migrants and refugees. There are the costs, so it's very, very expensive. And of course, the government spent only on this consultation far more money than they put aside for managing migration. A further step in fabricating moral panic against migration was the Black Billboard campaign, which was introduced, the first one in June 2015, but it was followed later on by new campaigns, billboard campaigns. Anyway, this first one, which formally were addressed to migrants, but they were put in Hungarians, so obviously no migrants would understand them, used these very well-known stereotypes about migrants being coming for welfare allowances, coming for stealing the jobs, and not respecting laws. So these were the statements. If you come to Hungary, you cannot take the jobs of Hungarians. If you come to Hungary, you have to keep our laws. Of course, everybody has to keep laws. Anyway, this campaign was ridiculed by some NGOs, but based on the results of the Billboard campaign and the results of the national consultation, Hungary's government initiated several legislative and policy steps to defend the country from illegal migrants. So this is the context into which actual refugee crisis arrived to. So by then, the public opinion was heavily so-called worked about how to think about migration and refugees. Okay, and here is some data from the European Social Survey. This is the behavioral element of attitudes, namely what people think about allowing immigrants to come and settle in their country. This question actually was asked about immigrants coming from poorer countries outside Europe. And here you can see a change. So the dotted lines show the difference between, so this axis is for the dotted lines, and it shows the changes from round 7 to round 8, so from before the migration crisis to after the migration crisis, and you can see that basically It is only in Hungary where attitudes became significantly worse. And also some of the Central East European countries or V4 countries like Czech Republic, Poland, and a little bit also Austria, where attitudes became somewhat more negative. But it is only in Hungary where this change was over 10%. And all the rest of Europe, in fact, became more accepting of Thailand. So I think that much of this change in Hungary can be attributed to the very negative governmental communication, anti-migrant communication. So now let me talk about the actual media analysis we made. So it's a comparative one between Austria and Hungary, and it focuses, because there was so overly immense amount of news, that we finally decided to only look into 3 key events or symbolic events of this refugee crisis. One was that happened on the 27th of August when a van with 71 bodies of refugees were found on the Austrian-Hungarian border in Austria. And we analyzed their 5 days of media coverage. The second event was the so-called refugee march. This is a long story, but basically refugees who were stranded around railway stations in Budapest gave up to wait for trains or to be allowed to embark on trains and started to walk towards Vienna. Those pictures probably you all remember, big waves of people walking on the motorway, on the main motorway. Here we again analyzed 4 or 5 days of media coverage. And the final one is actually 2 months. One is the border closure between Hungary and Serbia, and the other one is then unrest. So there was a riot following this border closure. So here we studied a longer period of time, over a week or approximately a week of media coverage. What did we analyze? So the sample of the media we analyzed was we tried to cover as much in terms of types of media, political orientation as possible. Of course, we had to make some limitations, so we selected public service television, both in Hungary and Austria. The largest audience, so one commercial television news programs with the largest audience. This was RTL in Hungary and +4 in Austria. And the print versions of press, of conservative or right-wing, liberal socialist newspapers, but these were all serious political papers. So, and one tabloid in both countries. And because in Hungary an online medium is very, very influential, it's index.hu, we also included that into our analysis. We used the multi-method analysis approach. We did a quantitative analysis, content analysis. We coded certain contents. Here are you can read what kind of contents we coded. And we made a multivariate analysis based on how the articles defined the problem concerning the refugee crisis or these events. And we also made a very in-depth and lengthy qualitative analysis of the TV news program on visual elements, editing, narratives. And finally, we put this all together with political strategies and political narratives coming from the parliament, so speeches, basically. So now I will only talk about the multivariate analysis, hopefully about the visual analysis, and we will see if I have time for the strategies of representation. Is everything clear until now? Please ask. I show the multivariate analysis of the problem definitions or problem identification of these news items, because it brought about, I think, a very meaningful result. And this is, I think, the most interesting outcome. I cannot speak about all the outcomes because it's really a lot. So we found that there were basically the news identified the problem, the events in terms of 5 major frames. One of the frames is humanitarianism, humanitarian crisis, so they identified events in terms of humanitarian crisis. In these articles, journalists argued that this is a humanitarian problem, about the number of refugees and the service and support to refugees by the state or by NGOs, so these were the topics there. The other major frame that we identified was a security threat, so articles that defined these events in terms of security threat to the country. And there were quite a substantial number of articles that defined, that framed events in terms of criticism towards the European Union, or in terms of criticism towards other countries, like Hungary blaming Austria or Germany, or so various countries blaming different countries, or the EU in general. And there were 2 minor frames. One is the articles that framed events in terms of consequence of war. So these articles put an emphasis on the situation in the sending countries. So they presented these war zones and why these people had to flee. And they also emphasized the aspect of human trafficking and humanitarian crisis in these zones, war zones. And the integration challenge was the 5th, that was quite minor, but these articles spoke mostly in terms of labor market integration, cultural integration, language, etc., etc. And this is the outcome of a lengthy analysis. And so this was the first event, second event, third and fourth. This is the Hungarian, and this is the Austrian. And the only thing I want to show here is that as time evolves, in Hungary, the more or less neutral representation of framing of the events turns very much into securitizing framing in the entire media. But if we only look at the public service media, the public service media was always, in all events, in the case of all of these events, emphasize the securitizing frame. But by the end of the story, or this story, I mean, end of September, or 15th of September, basically all media in Hungary in general turned towards a securitizing framing of the event.
This is for all types of media?
Yes, everything is put together. We also made separate analysis for each media, but I'm not going to present that because for that you need to know which media is what, and that's a bit lengthy. And in Austria, just the other way, from the beginning on, the humanitarian framing was there and was important. Basically, consequence of war is also some kind of humanitarian framing. And you can see that as time develops, basically in Austria, that media coverage turned very much into humanitarian framing of the events. The other important thing to emphasize is that even the events, the death van, so when 71 people were killed in a van, refugees, even that event did not provoke from the Hungarian media a humanitarian approach to explaining. So what are the characteristics of these frames of interpretation? That is also interesting. They typically focus on different events, they typically portray and voice different actors, and use different expressions for refugees, and also apply different visual strategies. Which means that I will show what kind of things they applied. For example, this is what kind of terminology they applied. Here we differentiated between four denominations for the actors. They either named it the immigrant, which is bevándorló in Hungary, or migrant, migráns in Hungarian, refugee or asylum seeker, or they were given some kind of human denomination, which means a woman, a mother, a child, person, so some kind of denomination which was independent from the refugee or migrant status. And here you can see that those presentations which framed the crisis in terms of a humanitarian crisis, they used mainly human denominations and refugees, while those which used the securitization as a framing, they used immigrant mostly. And here is the difference between the Austrian and the Hungarian media, again in terms of denominations of the three events individually. And the most important thing here is that although more or less half of the denomination used by, in all three cases, both in Hungary and Austria, were refugee, but the difference is the other half, namely that the Austrian media tended to use various human denominations, while the Hungarian media used in other half of the cases denominations like migrant and immigrant. And by that time, migrant was a very negative term, thanks to the previous governmental propaganda. Okay, how much time do I have?
7
half an hour. Like 7 minutes.
10 minutes. So I will be quick. And this is only a snapshot, because this was also a big analysis that I cannot present here. This is usually I show this to students to make them aware of how the media uses visualization in order to push the perception in different ways. And we also found this back when we analyzed the Roma's representation in the media, Roma's coverage, the minority group, Roma minority group, very similar strategies of visualization. So we call them, but we can debate on that, humanizing images and dehumanizing images, but we can debate on these. Humanizing images were much more characteristics for articles that try to present the events in terms of humanitarian crisis. These kind of representation, of course not exclusively, but in these kind of representations, showing people from the front, from close, showing facial features and emotions, showing individuals, so the stress on individuals and showing them as human beings having emotions was very emphatic, while dehumanizing images were much more likely showing immigrants or refugees or people from behind, from far, so that the audience was not able to identify with them or feel in the same way. Let me show you some of these. Yeah, these are of course cuts and they are haphazard, so, but I think they are quite characteristic. So first of all, showing close and far, from behind, from close, so those kind of images on the are ones which shows refugees from close, where you can see the features and where you can identify. They also, this guy even spoke. Usually they didn't speak. And these are the kind of representations very typical for the Hungarian public service news program that shows them in crowds from far behind, from far and from behind, most importantly, so that people feel the amount of people as a threat. Here are some other examples showing individuals versus crowd. This is also, if you look at this is all, most of the time this is Hirado, which is the public service media's evening news program. While on the other side, usually you'll see some other kind of either news, but mostly television news. Again, from front and showing images. That article, in fact, showed the refugees as that was the purpose, to show the individuals who were involved in the refugee crisis. and tell very shortly their stories. Which happened a lot in the Austrian media, but the Hungarian media that didn't really happen. That was, I think, the only such example we found. So they told their stories, who they are, where they come from. They came from with a family. So personalized the whole story. While the public service media, which really very heavily pushed this securitization frame, showed this kind of crowds where you only see the crowd that makes people who have never met migrants probably fearful. Showing human emotions, that was also, especially for RTL, and also for the Austrian media, very, very important strategy. Showing people mostly struggling, but also sometimes being happy. Even if in a crowd, you still see the child crying and the parents being anxious, while these images show violence. Showing vulnerability, that was also very important. So some of the media really emphasized the vulnerability of these people, and they helped them because some of the refugees got together and found out that they are newsworthy and they should show themselves as vulnerable, so they picked out those with some kind of disability and small children and put them in front of the camera. But also, if people are shown mothers with many children walking on the way or sleeping, okay, this mother is with 3 little kids and sleeping in really awkward conditions. So this was also a very important strategy to show immigrants by those media who wanted to present the crisis as a humanitarian crisis. While those media that wanted to show them the crisis as a security threat showed pictures that made viewers feel threatened by these migrants. Okay, that was also important. Many of the images showed suggested criminality. So there were many images, especially in the public service media, which showed people in handcuffs being searched. And also as a threat, that was very important, and that was a strategy of the also a conscious strategy that border guards were instructed, and also police was instructed to put on these masks and gloves when they deal with migrants, because it shows as a threat that was very much emphasized by governmental speakers, namely that this whole thing is a threat to the health system and it's contagious. Okay. Okay, so I turn now to the main findings. So the major frames that were applied were humanitarian frame, securitization frame, and criticism of other countries and EU refugee policies. I think that still, these kind of frames are still the predominant frames of explaining refugee crisis. There was a substantial division, but this division was not between the Hungarian representation or the Hungarian media's representation and the Austrian media representation at that time, but between the Hungarian public service or pro-government media and all other media outlets. The independence from the Hungarian government structured the framing of the events at that time. M1, which is the public service television, consistently used the securitization frame, both in its narratives and visual representations. It reported a combination of manipulative elements to push through the Hungarian government's very powerful anti-refugee message or anti-migrant message. They showed refugees almost exclusively as a threat, as a criminal threat, as an epidemic threat, as an unstoppable flow of people, and also very strongly as a security threat to the country. And other media, both in Hungary and in Austria, presented the crisis primarily as a humanitarian issue, both in its narratives and its visual representations, as well as terminology. But what was interesting to find is that in the Hungarian media, even the independent media, the governmental narrative was true as soon as violence turned in. So there was a violent riot after the closure of the border, and that riot was already framed also by the independent media as a security threat. Okay. There is much more in this research. You can read it, you can find it under this title. It's available on the Central European University Center for Media and Data Science homepage, so feel free to read it and ask any questions if you have.